I cannot say enough good things about the Daniel Negreanu class on poker, and now 10-time world champion Phil Ivey's courses on Texas Hold'em that I've watched and rewatched on Masterclass's platform. Both Ivey and Negreanu's classes have helped me establish sound fundamentals and even some advanced technique in my Texas Hold'em game. Those are only two of scores of courses available on the Masterclass platform. Grow yourself professionally or in your hobbies and support the show by using the link in the show notes. Now to our show.
This is Forgotten Wars.
All of us have thought we've known a person, understood a person, when we didn't. So many of us have scratched our heads when we watch someone act out or engage in a pattern of behavior we deem idiotic. And many of us have run into that moment when you're confronted by a part of that person's past that you didn't know before, by a story never previously told, by a traumatic experience they'd never shared. Then we realize that the person we've watched make repeated mistakes maybe wasn't acting so stupid, so insane in light of their previous experiences. We're going to sprint further back in time than we ever have or likely ever will for the entire season, to tell a story that will hopefully help you better understand so many of the characters in these Boer Wars.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire, but that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Act the part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
The casualties and the results of the first few battles of the First Boer War surprised the British and no small number of Boers. Defeat sometimes visited British forces in battle, but rarely did the British end any war in defeat. What happened over and over again in the First and the Second Boer Wars, the powerful British army faced off against the Boers at a major disadvantage in at least one respect for at least the onset of each war. The British lacked mounted men. They lacked cavalry. That's ironic, at least to me, because cavalry came for centuries as a centerpiece to the British army. Now, how exactly the British deployed cavalry nearly 1,000 years ago is difficult to determine, at least fully. The cavalry was likely used in battle tactics, like fake retreats in the Battle of Hastings. What we do know is that when medieval English armies were raised, each man had to have 2 to 4 horses to be considered properly equipped. To raise armies in medieval times, kings resorted to a number of methods. Having nobles or property owners provide X number of soldiers per pound or acre they owned. Paying nobles X amount per promised soldier they would raise, which enabled nobles to profit from a war, depending on the loyalty of knights and nobles to the king. Promising cavalry, sometimes infantry, a percentage of the plunder, or even offering prisoners their freedom for joining a war effort. Before the reign of King Henry VII, the English did not field standing armies. Before 1485, these medieval English armies were raised ad hoc, as needed. They functioned like private armies for rent. Henry VII began to change all this. The father of the better-known King Henry VIII initiated a massive expansion of the infantry, navy, and coastal defenses. King Henry VII began the British evolution towards having standing armies with a structured career path for its soldiers. This transition towards standing armies matched military trends in Western Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Both the cannon and the firearm grew more practical during his reign. This first king from the House of Tudors constantly sought the best forms of weapons and armor across Europe. Then he shrewdly made sure his nation manufactured these military necessities. King Henry VII's granddaughter, Elizabeth, the last of the House of Tudors, oversaw greatly accelerated growth of English armed forces thanks to constant war during the latter years of the 1500s. This constant war led to long-standing armies with increasingly more men rising through professional military ranks via meritocracy. However, the purchase of a promotion of a higher rank still persisted. One historian said that when England descended into civil war in the 1640s, quote, England turned Germany, end quote. Meaning that both sides in the Civil War resorted to total war. Both sides drafted men into their armies. Both sides requisitioned supplies. Both sides seized or even destroyed enemy property. Both sides took the sword or even fire to the civilian population. A war that involved almost 200 different states finally ended with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. After the 30 Years' War, the transition towards standing armies continued across Europe. France, Sweden, Denmark, Russia, Spain, Savoy, Austria, and some small German states within the Holy Roman Empire adopted regular armed forces in peacetime after 1648 to unify and subjugate their respective territories. A relatively bloodless revolution 40 years later permanently shaped English military history again. When William of Orange took the English throne in 1688, this marked the beginning of Parliament primarily raising English armies instead of the king. These larger standing English armies grew more expensive to maintain, but that didn't mean that soldiers were well paid. Most British soldiers saw no choice but to resort to working part-time, seasonal jobs to make ends meet. Many resorted to looting and other criminal behavior only to face light punishment or authorities turning a blind eye. Officers got in on the corruption when they skimmed money off of the top of what they were supposed to be paying troops under their command. If recruiters were really desperate in the 17th century, they literally kidnapped men and forced them into army units far away from home. Prisoners were often offered their freedom in exchange for working without pay for many years in the English army. What did improve in the 1690s was weaponry. The matchlock rifle gave way to the flintlock, the pike to the bayonet. Then one of the most decorated, successful, and reputable British generals of all time emerged. From 1702 to 1711, the Duke of Marlborough fought 10 campaigns, including 4 epic battles and 30 sieges. That Duke of Marlborough was John Churchill. Yes, an ancestor of Winston Churchill. John Churchill led 2 successful amphibious operations, seizing Gibraltar off the Spanish coast and the island of Minorca. This Duke of Marlborough oversaw the consolidation of East India Company holdings in present-day India, and further victory over the French and Spanish in North America. The Captain General of British forces would have made Sun Tzu proud with his heavy financial investment in intelligence gathering, his use of deception, his use of feigned and flanking moves. The Duke of Marlborough won the respect of his soldiers in showing genuine care for their lives. Their lives were too valuable for Churchill to waste. He didn't reform military systems, but the Duke did make the systems work to their maximum capacity. John Churchill did suffer some defeats and had his opponents and detractors, and still has some detractors today. But before he fell out of favor with the royal family, the Duke of Marlborough won the British, in the words of historian David Chandler, quote, a degree of martial success and international recognition that they had not known since the Middle Ages, end quote. Chandler continues, few commanders born in the British Isles have achieved as much as Marlborough. None has achieved more. Surely he laid the foundation of the British Army's future achievements, end quote. A problem that John Churchill did not address was, you guessed it, the poor pay of soldiers. Pay of soldiers remained so terrible into the 1770s that soldiers would desert around harvest time if they were farmers, or continue to take up part-time jobs as cobblers, for example. According to historian Alan Guy, regiments even stooped to recruiting, quote, men suffering from blindness, lameness, and scorbutic ulcers, worms, epilepsy, hemorrhoids, fingers, arms, and ankles out of joint, end quote. Parliament prided itself in the 18th century for civilianizing the military rather than allowing the militarizing of Parliament. Alan Guy writes, quote, "A minority of privileged officers, peers of the realm, members of Parliament, and their close connections, clustered thickly in the upper reaches of the hierarchy as generals, governors of the larger garrisons, and colonels of regiments." End quote. British Prime Minister Henry Pelham maybe encapsulated this dynamic best with his rhetorical question, quote, "Has it not always been with good reason urged that our liberties are in no danger from our standing army because it is commanded by men of the best families and fortunes?" End quote. Despite this dynamic during the rise of the British Empire, British generals and officers started to gain more recognition towards the end of the 18th century. Jugs and other pottery started getting engraved with the images of famous generals and officers. This growth of the British Empire and correlating growth in popularity of British officers did not come without costly lessons. If you would like to help keep Forgotten Wars producing and growing, would you do at least 2 of 3 things? First, would you share a link to the podcast with someone you think might enjoy it? Second, if you're listening on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or other providers, would you make sure to like or follow our podcast? If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, would you give us a 5-star rating and write a thoughtful review there? You can even do that while you're listening. Lastly, if you want more from the show, bonus episodes, behind the mic access, transcripts and sources, and much more, and you want to support the show, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/ForgottenWars. That is patreon.com/ForgottenWars. The link is also in this episode's notes. Thanks to those of you who have done one of these things already. Know that you're appreciated. Now, back to our episode. Cartagena taught the British a brutal lesson in 1741. Hoping to gain more riches, more access to resources for merchants, and ultimately the British Empire, the British attempted an amphibious assault on Cartagena, now in present-day Colombia. 9 of the Empire's regiments, along with about 1,500 more men cobbled from Caribbean garrisons, formed one of the largest British expeditionary forces ever unleashed on the Caribbean. But this force crowded too tightly aboard its ships to where nearly 1,300 men were sick by the time their ships reached Jamaica. By the time the expeditionary force reached Cartagena, nearly 500 men, including the original commander, had died. The survivors eagerly stepped onto solid ground in Cartagena, only to run into a more lethal situation. No, bullets did not meet these British survivors. Something worse did. The Spanish had very modest forts defending their colony, their Cartagena. Instead of extensive, expensive forts, the Spanish relied on something else, something that only cost a few days' time, a few days of holding out against a besieging enemy. The newly promoted commander of the British Expeditionary Force, Brigadier Wentworth, knew about what this more lethal, largely invisible force of death could do to his men. Wentworth tried to avoid prolonged sieges of Spanish forts. But he and his associate didn't think the British force could just rush the Spanish forts and hope for the best. So Wentworth ordered fortifications built and ladders constructed, slow and systematically as if they were trying to launch an invasion in a place that wasn't constantly looking for a helpless host. This preparation time cost the British dearly. At the time of this recording, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control says there is still no cure for yellow fever. When mosquitoes infected with yellow fever bit their helpless British hosts, these survivors of the treacherous voyage dropped with horrific aches and pains, severe liver disease, and yellowing of the skin, jaundice. These survivors suffered again, but this time they died. 85% of the time. 85%. Yellow fever terrified the British the most. Over the long term, malaria would actually kill more foreigners trying to make Cartagena their own. You see, malaria could strike the same victim over and over again with deadly flu-like symptoms. These deadly, largely unseen forces drove British morale deep, deep down. Can you imagine? You're a soldier who survives the voyage where almost 500 people, including your original commander, died. You're working slowly to prepare your assault on some Spanish stronghold so far from looking strong, while your comrades are dropping left and right with fever, uncontrollable bleeding, and yellow skin that haunts you. Then your new commander Wentworth, who seems in a little over his head, finally orders an assault on Fort St. Lazare. Something like relief may wash over you until the assault begins. Then dread overcomes you. Why? Because the ladders you were ordered to build for this assault were too short. You can't scale the fort's walls. You're sitting ducks. The attack fails. You have to retreat. As you run away from the fort in shame, in disgrace you thought you'd never taste, you take a bullet to the back. You end up as one of the 200 killed and 377 British wounded in this demoralizing attack that would effectively abort this attempt to take Cartagena. But this stubborn attempt on Cartagena died a slow death. 3,000 more British soldiers arrived. This only benefited the mosquitoes, who now had another batch of new hosts to sink themselves into. Nearly 1 year later, of the 10,000 British soldiers who set out on this expedition, only 2,600 were alive. Of the 7,400 who lost their lives on this expedition, only 600 fell in battle. Yellow fever and malaria, they killed the rest. This British failure at Cartagena provided a costly, humiliating lesson in how not to conduct future amphibious campaigns. Many doctors made medieval decisions in treating disease-riddled British soldiers. But some good doctors gathered scientific intelligence on how to prevent disease. But military bureaucracy moved slowly in doing the good doctor's bidding. Over 20 years later, the 7 Years' War broke out across 5 continents. While the British fought for control of North America with the French and various native tribes, disease did disproportionate damage. For every British soldier killed in action during the 7 Years' War, 8 died of disease. Scurvy was the chief culprit, causing its victims to suffer bone pain, easy bruising, anemia, gum disease, fever, convulsions, spontaneous bleeding, and often death. The frustrating thing here is that the British military did not implement what they had already learned about preventing scurvy in 1747 from Dr. James Lind aboard the HMS Salisbury. Lest you get the impression that the British just went from campaign to campaign bugling everything they tried, know that they were the best fighting force in the world for most of the 18th century. Historian Tony Hayter wrote that, quote, "In terms of martial qualities, particularly dogged persistence in attack and defense, the ability to improvise and to develop new tactics, the British Army was second to none." End quote. The British did defeat the French in the 7 Years' War, after all. This was their most major victory of the century. But even afterwards, this victory came with a steep cost. The British tried in vain to reduce their costs of policing their American colonies to pre-7 Years' War levels. They turned too many American colonists against the Empire, trying to get those colonists to pay the military costs of maintaining their colonial security. The British seriously erred when they showed contempt for American fighting ability. Though the Americans could have doubled down much more on the success of their early guerrilla tactics, the British ultimately erred again, sticking too much to their conventional set-piece battle techniques for too long. Sticking to conventional tactics in the face of the overwhelming need to adapt, if that doesn't already sound familiar to you, it will. The American Revolution had scarcely subsided before the French Revolution erupted. So did the size of the British Regular Army. The British Regular Army stood at 40,000 in 1793, but ballooned to 250,000 by the French Revolution's end, about the time William Gladstone had his first memories. The British Army's growth created demand for more officers and NCOs. To control costs, the Army sold officer commissions to aristocrats with no military experience. One British colonel at the time pointed out that, quote, "An officer who had money could purchase up to the rank of a lieutenant colonel in 3 weeks or a month," end quote. Frederick Augustus, the young Duke of York, became commander-in-chief of the British Army in 1795. He did much to reverse this practice of paying for promotions and commissions. Augustus blazed a broader trail for men to join the NCO and officer ranks through merit, not money, and/or aristocratic bloodline. Augustus demanded a minimum of 2 years military experience before anyone could be promoted to captain, and 6 years for anyone to be promoted beyond captain. The Duke of York streamlined military decision-making as much as he could, establishing the military secretary position as the only channel to the commander-in-chief. Augustus established the Military College, a school for cadets that would become the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. The Duke improved military rations, military barracks, and healthcare provision. He standardized drills and tactics, and made the military punishments more humane. He improved military life and discipline by implementing many of Sir John Moore's ideas. These reforms paid off in the Napoleonic Wars, where improved British discipline, training, and skill emerged before Europe's eyes. But the British Army pay continued to be pitiful. To put the plight of the British soldiers serving abroad in the early 1800s in its sorry perspective, a dockyard worker working for the British Navy earned 4 times as much per week. British militiamen earned 3 times as much as the British soldiers serving abroad. As you can imagine, the British Army struggled to fill its ranks, so the British Army filled 20% of its ranks with foreign recruits. The British Army receded in importance and size after the Napoleonic Wars. Serious fears of foreign invasion faded, with popular fears of French invasion flaring in the 1840s and 1850s. Being an island nation with the world's preeminent navy, Britain enjoyed the luxury of not wanting or needing a large standing army. Army stations at home stayed small, except within Ireland to keep order. The Army's annual budget dove from £43 million in 1815 to £8 million in 1836. But British soldiers still commanded costly investments when it came to pensions and especially hospitalizations. The average British soldier was hospitalized once a year. This was roughly the same in North America and the Cape Colony. For example, the mortality rate for British soldiers serving on the Gold Coast, around present-day Ghana, was 668 men per 1,000. The health of British soldiers serving around the world did start to improve by the 1860s, but even then, a force of 70,000 serving in India lost nearly 5,000 men each year. Soldiers deserted their posts around the empire at a rate of 4%. So around the empire, a cost-cutting measure grew more common. They leaned on local colonial recruits. These local recruits carried more disease immunity, didn't command pensions, and often were paid by their local colony instead of British taxpayers. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of natives bolstered British regiments in South Africa, for example. British barrack life still remained terrible through much of the 19th century. A soldier often got only 200 to 300 cubic feet of space in the barracks or the hospital. This was less than half of what British prisoners were supposed to receive by standard. British soldiers were discouraged from marrying by their commanding officers. There still weren't separate quarters provided for married soldiers and their spouses after the 1850s. Instead, military leadership turned blind eyes to soldiers sleeping with prostitutes unless venereal diseases got out of hand. The Army was a seductive, coercive escape for adulterers, criminals, people with few job options, recruits often being seduced with liquor to join. For a time, the military didn't care about the morals of their recruits. The officer class and soldiers had a huge social class gap, with officers having demeaning or paternalistic attitudes towards their men. Flogging and brutal corporal punishment only started to see a decline after the Napoleonic Wars. Before, an officer could technically flog a man 300 times. This 300 flog max was reduced to only 200, and then by the 1860s, only 50 for the worst crimes. Henry Grey, also known as Viscount Howick, served in the War Office and in 2 cabinet positions in the mid-19th century. He pushed through reforms to improve the lives of soldiers via libraries, savings banks for soldiers' extra money so it wasn't spent on liquor, better food, recreation space, and better medical care and barracks. Gray did win transitions to shorter enlistments of only 10 years for soldiers. Afterwards, these soldiers could choose to join a reserve unit. The British military leadership remained inefficiently split into 6 major departments: the War Office, the Colonial Office, the Home Office, Treasury, Horse Guards, and Ordnance. These departments often fought for resources or slow-walked or thwarted reforms they didn't like. When the British met disaster at the siege of Sevastopol during the 1850s Crimean War, though, the departments were combined into 3, but this made marginal differences at best. Florence Nightingale did win the British soldier more sanitary conditions after the Crimean War, and the British soldier did win more respect from the press and the public after putting down the Sepoy Rebellion just before 1860. Edward Cardwell served as the British Secretary of State from 1868 to 1874. Cardwell continued to improve the British military. The British soldier did see increasingly better conditions from the 1870s onward. Their service terms were reduced from 10 years to 6 or 7 year terms. These reduced terms for British soldiers were thanks largely to increasing reliance on locally raised colonial troops across the empire. Cardwell's Localization Bill of 1872 paved the way, at least in theory and statute, for more British men to serve on units drawn from around their neighborhoods. Cardwell oversaw the abolition of branding British soldiers. It wasn't until 10 years later, the same year the First Boer War ended, that flogging met its end as an allowable punishment. Soldiers still remained poorly paid through the First and even through the Second Boer War. So, soldiering still seemed alluring mostly to lower-class men. Soldiers were still discouraged from marrying. 25% of soldiers faced unemployment after their service terms. Soldiers still were discriminated against in restaurants, theaters, and other public establishments. That discrimination is sad and so hard to imagine in my country today. For you to better understand the 2 Boer Wars, you need to understand the 2 rings that dominated the British Army for a time. You've already heard in previous episodes about Sir Garnet Wolseley, the general who arrived in South Africa just after Lord Chelmsford hastily finished the Zulus off before Wolseley could. The same Wolseley who showed contempt for the Boers. Wolseley won his reputation leading successful campaigns in the Second Burma War, the Crimean War, the Sepoy Mutiny, and the China War. To ensure future success, Wolseley handpicked a ring of trusted officers to help him win future campaigns, like in the Ashanti War. The Wolseley ring included several officers such as then Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Wood, Major George Colley, yes, the Colley we know, and Captain Redfurs Buller, someone you will hear plenty about in future episodes. Wolseley forming his ring provided more cohesion and continuity from campaign to campaign, and helped his officers win more promotions and recognition. Wolseley's ring, also known as the Ashanti Ring, embittered British political leadership and military leaders not able to break into the ring and gain access to experience and fame that this ring offered. Sir Frederick Roberts won himself a sterling reputation when he helped suppress the Sepoy Rebellion and later won the decisive victory of the Second Afghan War in fall 1880. Roberts formed his own more conservative ring of officers. This Roberts Ring, or India Ring, bitterly rivaled Wolseley's ring, which made hostility within Army Command more acute. Officers within these rival rings would question each other's judgment or courage quite often. This rivalry reared its head at the end of the First Boer War, but even more so during the lead-up to and waging of the Second Boer War. One of the members of these rival rings will be shot dead when we return to the First Boer War. For years, I've looked forward to becoming a father. On October 27th of this year, our first child was born, 1 week late, but only 6 pounds and 12 ounces. Evan Michael Buster. We are all very happy and healthy. Even after a few nearly sleepless nights, this fatherhood thing still doesn't feel real. But it is wonderful. Wish me luck, or say your prayers for us. Talk to you next week. I have yet another limited time announcement for you on this July 23rd, 2021. If you'd like to learn more about British military history in even greater depth, I have great news for you. Rather than letting the 20 or so books that I used to help me write this season of Forgotten Wars just sit in storage or on a shelf forever, I'm going to be mailing those books to loyal listeners like you. I relied heavily on the Oxford History of the British Army, edited by David Chandler, to help me write this particular episode 1.11. If you're hearing this announcement, then you have the opportunity to win this Oxford History of the British Army by doing something free and simple. First, share episode 1.3 of the show via email or on social media. If you'd like an example of text you could use to share episode 1.3, check out this episode's show notes. It would go something like, want to learn about the Boer Wars and other clashes that ravaged South Africa after European settlement? Then start with episode 1.3 of the Forgotten Wars podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and most other places you find podcasts. Next, when people reply to your email or react to your share on social media, take a screenshot. Finally, send me a screenshot of your share with the accompanying responses you got from people. The first person to send me a screenshot that meets this criteria will get the Oxford History of the British Army mailed at my expense to them with a note of gratitude from me as well. Again, I will mail the book for free to the winner. Once I've got a winner, I will erase this announcement promptly. All right, share episode 1.3. It's a win-win.